I'm George, this is my S12. Under the hood, I have an S13 SR20DET that I've wired to be fully functional and compatible with not only my S12 harness, but also with the gauge cluster. Today, I'm gonna show you how. We're gonna cover identifying all of the wires that you're gonna need, how to test those wires to make sure that you have the right ones, the way that I routed my harness to get everything to fit in place, and lastly, figuring out how to wire some of the slightly more complicated circuits that are a little bit more than just connecting two wires together. Whether it's an SR you're installing in your S12 or a different engine, or maybe you're putting an SR into a completely different car, I guarantee that there is something that you will be able to use from this video. Now it's gonna be a long one, let's get to it. Let's talk about all the connectors that are gonna be involved in wiring this together. Starting off up here on the driver's side of the S12. You have this 6-pin connector. Right. This 8-pin connector, these are both just gray 6 and 8 pins. And then on the S13 engine harness side, now this is all kind of taped together, so it might be a little bit harder to see. You have this gray 8-pin connector, and then the brown 8-pin connector. Moving to the other side, we have the lower harness. This is what connects to the alternator, to the transmission, but I'll get into that in a bit. So over here, you really only have one thing you need to be worried about. It's right down there and a little bit difficult to see. There's a gray 8-pin connector that is mounted directly to the frame rail on the side. That's what you're gonna wanna be able to see. Right there. And the last thing is the dash connector. That one comes right off of the ECU, and it's in the driver's side footwell. Starting off with identifying our wires. I've got my trusty notes because I'm not gonna be able to remember everything off the top of my head. We're starting with the S12 harness and the 6-pin connector. Now this connector has the light green wire with a black stripe, which is for the electronic fuel injection power. The purple with a white stripe, this guy right here, and what that is for your coolant gauge. Now the black wire with a white stripe is your ECU backup. And lastly, on the other side here, you have your fuel pump. That's 2 wires, but I'll get into the details of that later. Quick interjection here. I realized that when I was initially recording, I said I was gonna get back to the fuel pump wiring and I completely forgot to. So I mentioned it's 2 wires, but only one of them is really your fuel pump wire. Let me explain. You have rather thick wire, right? A single one. And what ends up happening is as you get close to your 8-pin connector, what ends up happening is it splits off into 2, right? So you have the outer portion of the wire that goes to 1 pin, and then you have this inner core of your wire that goes to another, right? Let me just get rid of that there. Now what this is, the outer portion is a shielding around your actual fuel pump wire. And it's the inner wire right here that is going to be at 12 volts. The outer portion is just a grounded shielding. It doesn't carry any current. It's not used to send any signal. It's just to protect the other wires around it from the electromagnetic signal from your rather high current draw fuel pump. Back to where I was. On the gray 8-pin connector on the S12 side, the only wire you need to be concerned with is the black wire with a red stripe right here. That is your IAC power wire. And now moving over to the other side, we are going to take a look at the lower harness, the one that's a little bit harder to see. This one was a little bit more difficult to get to, but let's go through it. We don't need this wire. Right here, black with a yellow stripe, that is our start signal. Then we have this yellow wire here, that's the oil pressure gauge. The white wire with a red stripe is for the dash light for a low battery. And this chunky white wire right here, that one is for the alternator field coil. So without this wire, your alternator won't actually charge the battery. And then we have these two, the green and the green with the yellow stripe. I treat them as a pair because they are. This is for your reverse lights. That's it for the S12. Now we're gonna start looking at the engine harness side, so the SR side, the S13 side. starting with our brown 8-pin connector. Where are we? We're right down here. There is the brown wire, which is convenient. Right here it is. The brown wire is for sensor power. We have the black wire with a pink stripe. You'll notice it's cut. That is for the fuel pump. There is the the green with an orange stripe. That is your neutral safety switch. And then there is red with a black stripe. That is your ignition switch. Now, staying on the SR engine harness, we have this chopped up 8-pin connector. Now we have the black wire with a yellow stripe. This is your air regulator or your idle air control. We have black with a white stripe. Where's that? That one's right here. Black with a white stripe is your electronic fuel injections, your EFI circuits. Red here is your ECU backup. And then you have blue with an orange stripe. That's this guy right here. And that is for coil pack power. Now, for the dash connector, I'm gonna have to crawl under my dash to show you this. I am upside down under my dash, but I'm getting you the information you need. So we have the dash connector right here, and the two wires you want to be concerned with are the blue with a black stripe. This is the wire that goes from the ECU to the dash connector for the dash's coolant temperature gauge. And the other wire is this orange guy right here. That orange wire is your start signal. I've told you which wires you're gonna need for the S12, but it's not just about looking at the wires. We can actually test it to make sure that you have the right ones. Now, in order to do this, I'm using two very simple things. First off, multimeter. Check the voltage, that's all you'll need there. The other thing is a probe. If you can take some of these pins and just put them to a ground, you're gonna see the car do things, and that's gonna tell you that you have the right wires. Starting with the tests on the S12 6-pin connector. I've got it disconnected right here. And like I mentioned, the black wire with the white stripe. That's this pin in the corner here. That is the ECU backup. That means with the key out of the car, we should see 12 volts. And we do. The next pin is also an always hot pin. This is your fuel pump wire. And this is also always hot, even when the key's out of the car. And we're seeing 12 volts again. Perfect. Now, the fuel pump is an always hot wire, and another way you can test it is just by putting it to ground. That's gonna complete your fuel pump circuit. You should hear it run. That's our fuel system. Now I have the key in the car and it's turned to the ignition point, which means that our light green wire with a black stripe, the EFI power, should be showing us 12 volts. Testing it right here, we have 12 volts. Beautiful. Let's take a look at our purple and white wire. I don't actually remember the voltage on this because this isn't usually how I test it, but it should be 5 volts. It should be 5 volts. Oh, there it was. There's the 5 volts. All right, might be a weak connection, but it's there. The black wire with the yellow stripe, I'm not gonna test right now, but that's your start signal. So in the same way as we tested the light green with the black stripe, checking for 12 volts when the key's in a certain position, have someone sit in the car, turn the key all the way to the start, and you'll see that 12 volts coming on. The last thing that I wanna show is the purple with a white stripe, what happens when it goes to ground. So using the probe, when you put the purple wire with a white stripe for the temperature gauge to ground, you see the needle move. Now testing the gray S12 8-pin connector. Again, the only wire we're concerned with is the red wire with a black stripe. Now I currently have the key in the ignition position, which means our pin should have 12 volts, and it does. Now, on the 8-pin connector on the lower harness, I'm not actually gonna go through these tests, but I'll show you how I would do them. Reason being, the chassis harness side of the connector is buried way down there. It was really easy to take a look at when the engine wasn't in the car, but now that the engine's actually there, it's difficult to kind of get to. But I'll show you what I would test, right? So we're looking at the engine side of this, right? There's this yellow wire right here, and that is for the oil pressure gauge. Now, if you take your probe and you put that to a ground, you're gonna see the gauge move exactly like we saw with the temperature gauge. Now, there's the white wire with a red stripe. This one right here, and that is for the battery indicator light on your dash, which is probably on for me. And if you take that and again, with your probe, just stick it to ground, you're gonna see that light come on. Lastly, we have the green and the green with the yellow stripe. I mentioned that those were a pair. Those are for your reverse lights. So if you just bridge the connection between the two of them, so each side of your probe into each of the two wires, you're gonna see your reverse lights come on. Now let's get to the meat and potatoes, what we connect to what. So starting with the S12, the gray 6-pin connector for the upper harness. We have 4 wires, EFI, light green with a black stripe, or ECU backup, black with a white stripe. We have purple with a white stripe for our temp gauge, and then black with yellow. I don't have a yellow dry erase, so this is actually a cut up post-it note, is our start signal. That connects on the SR side to the gray 8-pin connector. Also don't have gray, it's just black. EFI, black with a white stripe. And our ECU backup wire, that is a solid red. Now, we also have the temp gauge and the start signal on the SR20. Those are blue with a black stripe and solid orange. These are on the dash connector. That's the one that comes right off of the ECU. I don't remember how many pins are in there, but it's quite a few. It's like a boxy white connector. So, EFI connects to EFI. ECU backup goes to, again, the ECU backup on the gray SR20 8-pin connector. And our temp gauge and start signal both connect to the dash connector on the blue and black stripe and the solid orange. Now, we're talking about the gray 8-pin connector on the S12, and I'm re-recording this because I made a mistake initially. So, we have the black wire with a red stripe, which is your air controller power, right? And that, quite simply, is connected to the black wire with a yellow stripe that we identified on the gray 8-pin connector on the SR20. And that is naturally going to provide power to your idle air controller. Now, we are going to talk about the S12 coil wires. I have one of my old S12 coils right here. There is a black wire with a white stripe. Now, keep in mind, the S12 has sparks on both banks, which means 2 coils, 2 black wires with white stripes that provided lots and lots of power to these coils. Now, that power is also switched, which means it only comes on when the key is turned into the on position. These 2 sources of power are going to go to, on the SR side, the gray 8-pin connector. There's a blue wire with an orange stripe. You'll notice it's a little bit thicker. That is to power your coil packs. The other wire is the red with a black stripe on the brown 8-pin connector, and that is for your ignition switch. So the way that I wired this is I took one coil wire, put power here, and then the other coil wire and put power there. Now you could bridge these and then fork off, however you want to do it. But I do recommend making use of the power source from both of these, because the coil packs in particular are going to be using a fair bit of power. You want to make sure that you have enough juice there. Now, there is one more connection that you need to make from the S12 coil wires. That is the black wire with the white stripe that goes to either of your original S12 engine's coils. And that is to the brown wire, no stripe, on the brown 8-pin connector on the SR20 side. And what that does is it provides power to your O2 sensor. So you connect this here, and your O2 sensor has power when the key is in the ignition position. Something I nearly forgot to mention, because it isn't technically wiring, but is essential for you to get your gauge cluster working, is your speedometer and the speed sensor. Now on the S12, you have a mechanical speed sensor. So there's the mechanical, the physical wire that goes from the transmission all the way up to behind the gauge cluster, and it spins as your trans is spinning, and that's what tells your cluster how fast you're moving. Now, on the SR transmission, it's all the way at the back. There's a little, I think it's an 8mm bolt. You can slide it right out, and there's a red plastic gear on the end of it. Now, what's inconvenient is the SR uses an electronic speed sensor because it has an electronic dash. The S12 uses the mechanical speed sensor, but the S12 speed sensor is compatible with the S13 transmission. So you literally just pull it out of your S12 manual trans, stick it into the SR manual trans, and you have a speedometer. Woo! Now, let's talk about the 8-pin connector on the S12 on the lower harness, so on the passenger side of the vehicle. Starting with the oil pressure gauge wire. That is a yellow wire. You have your alternator field coil. I didn't really know how to draw this. It's just a thick white wire. I gave it an outline because white on white doesn't really show up too well. You have your battery indicator light. That is a white wire with a red stripe. And then you have two wires here. Your reverse are green, and I forgot to fill in the yellow. And green with a yellow stripe. See it there? Wow, look at that, lovely. Now, this is a little embarrassing. After that blunder, on the SR side, the oil pressure switch. Now that is just closer to the firewall, but right next to where you have your oil filter. I don't remember what color that wire is, but it's there, it's there. Has the oil pressure switch. You have the alternator field coil wire. On the SR side, they kept it simple, thick white wire, thick white wire. The battery light on the SR side is also a white wire with a red stripe. And your reverse wires here, they go to a switch on the transmission, but we'll get to that. Now, the wire for your oil pressure gauge wires to the oil pressure switch. Now it is a switch on the SR, not a sender. I'm gonna talk about that a little later. Your alternator field coil wire, that big chunky white one, goes to the corresponding big chunky white alternator field coil wire. Your white wire with a red stripe for the battery light goes to the white with a red stripe. Now, your reverse lights, they connect to one another via a switch on your transmission. Now, that switch, there are going to be, I believe it's 3 distinct switches that are on your transmission. Oh my goodness. There are 1, 2, 3 switches that end up on your transmission. This is your gear lever. I am an artist. There. Now, you're going to connect these 2 wires to the 2 wires that come off the frontmost switch. So the one that's nearest the front of the car, nearest the engine. And again, like I mentioned, you can test this just by connecting them, watching your reverse lights go on. That's where you hook those up.
Before we talk about wiring the fuel pump, you'll need to know how a relay works. If that's already covered for you, skip to this time. Let's cover how a relay works. So, I'm going to divide this relay up into 2 sections. But generally speaking, a relay is what you use to have one electrical circuit control another electrical circuit, right? So, this top portion of the relay, I'm going to refer to as the control side. And then the bottom is going to be the switched side. Now, this little squiggly here is an electromagnet. Essentially, when you provide it with electrical current, it will attract this switch, closing it, completing the switched side of the circuit. So, in order to activate this electromagnet, you need 2 things. You need voltage on one side, and you need a ground on the other. If you have both of those ingredients, then wire A and wire B will be connected. This electromagnet is gonna close this switch by pulling it upwards, and you're gonna have a completed circuit there. Now, if you don't have 12 volts, but you have a ground, this isn't going to be powered up and you're not going to have a closed connection here. If you have 12 volts going to this, but you have no ground on the other side, again, completely inactive, this will remain open. You will have no connection between A and B. That's a relay. Now, how are we going to use a relay to wire in this fuel pump, right? So we already know that our fuel pump wire is a constant 12 volts, right? We've tested that. We see that you have this 12 volts. It's always on, whether the key's in the car or not. You don't need the ignition, none of that, right? And we know that when we take this 12 volt fuel pump wire and we put it to ground, our fuel pump runs, right? That's the switched side of our circuit here. Now, we need something to control this, right? Well, the ECU, we know, controls the fuel pump. And we've already identified the wire that does this. It is the black wire with a pink stripe, right? Now, this goes to ground whenever, this goes to ground whenever the ECU wants the fuel pump to run, right? We've already covered this requires a power source and a ground. Now the power source here, I'm gonna write this as S power. What that means is switched power. Now, whether this is grounded or not, you don't want to be giving your relay power unless the key is on, the ignition is on, right? Because suppose this grounds out somewhere on your chassis. I don't know, you don't wrap your wires properly, it's not well insulated, and you have a short, it goes to ground. You don't want your fuel pump running all the time. And keep in mind, this is going to have power all of the time, right? So you want to use a switched power source, something that's only active when the key is on. And for that, I recommend the black wire with a white stripe that goes to either of the S12's original coils, right? So you have the two coils that are only active when the key is on. They have these big beefy wires that only have power when the key is on, and that's what you should use for your switched power source. Now, you're probably thinking, if this needs to go to ground, right? Your fuel pump goes to ground to run the fuel pump, and the ECU grounds the black wire with a pink stripe whenever it needs the fuel pump to run. Why don't you just connect your fuel pump wire to the ECU's black wire with a pink stripe and you're done? You're not though, right? The S12 has this old, massive, clunky ECU that is very capable of grounding a high amperage circuit. So your fuel pump is going to be running it up to 10 amps, right? The ECU for the S13 is not capable of grounding 10 amps, right? I haven't tested this, but I've been told that it will fry your ECU if you send high amperage down this wire. So that's why we need the relay, right? This is going to be for a low power circuit. This little electromagnet is low power enough, right? This high amperage goes to any chassis ground, right? Anything that's a good solid ground will do, and that's how you're going to run your fuel pump. So the ECU is still controlling it. It'll only ever run when you have the ignition on, and your 12 volts goes to ground. Now let's talk about the circuit that has given me the most trouble wiring on my own car, and that is the RPM gauge. Now, before we get into how it's wired for the SR, let's talk about how it's wired originally for the S12. Now, the S12 has coils that go to the distributor and then to all 4 spark plugs, 1 coil for each bank of the engine. Now, this is the coil drawn here, right? And there's a blue wire that comes off of the primary coil, the one that runs all the way through the RPM gauge, not the one that stops at 4,000 RPM. All the way through the RPM range, excuse me. Now, this is the negative side of the coil, right? So it is grounded. And you have this big electrical pulse from the coil, right? It's a high voltage. So it goes to ground, but then there's still residual current that goes to the SMJ. Now the SMJ is the super multi-junction. It's the massive connector that's in the footwell on the passenger side of the car, right? At this point, you end up with a light green wire. That light green wire is part of the dash harness or the instrument harness. And it goes up all the way to the back of the gauge cluster. And that's where your tachometer gets its signal from. Now, let's talk about the SR side of things. The SR is kind of fundamentally different in that it doesn't have just one coil. It has 4 coils, right? It's a coil over plug design. I say 1 coil, the S12 has 2. I'm just talking about the primary. So it's a coil over plug design. So it has 4 coils. Now, the tach here, because it is a signal coming off of the coil, it's expecting kind of like a high voltage pulse, right? The SR's ECU only sends a 5-volt signal for the S13 tach, so we need to wire it differently. Now, this right here is the igniter, right? The igniter has 5 wires that come in from the ECU, the middle one being a ground, and the other 4 being signals telling the engine to spark, right? What you're gonna wire in on the coil side of the igniter, so the higher voltage side, is 4 diodes. Now, what a diode is essentially an electrical component that allows current to flow one way, but does not allow current to flow in the other way, right? So you have a pulse coming on each of these whenever its respective coil is sparked. Now these little connections are just showing that you're teeing into these lines on the coil side, and you're getting these 4 diodes wired in. Now, what a diode looks like, they're very small, and there's an indication on one side, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see that, showing the direction in which current flows. Now, there are different specifications for diodes. I'll not even pretend I don't know much about it, but what you need is 1N4004 diodes, right? And you need 4 of them, 1, 2, 3, 4. What you're gonna do is tee in on the ignition, on the coil side of the igniter, and then you're taking all 4 of these connections and you're going to combine them, right? In the same way as the S12 coil sparks once per cylinder, you want a signal that sparks once per cylinder. It's important you do this on the other side of the diode, because if you connect all of these, then without the diodes, you're gonna be sending a spark signal to your coil, to all 4 of your coils every time you want any one of your cylinders to spark. You're gonna end up with terrible misfires, don't do it. So you now have this connection, right? And it will receive an electric pulse every time any one of your sparks goes off. That's what you want. Now you take this and you're gonna connect to the dash harness side of your original circuit, right here. Now notice I removed this. You want to cut the wire on the dash side of the SMJ. Otherwise, this is gonna end up going to ground and you're gonna get no spark. So I tested this, and as soon as I connected the wire without cutting it here, my engine just immediately died because none of the coils were receiving their signals because everything was just going straight to ground. So once you cut the light green wire on the dash side of the SMJ and you connect the signal coming from all 4 of your diodes, again, on the coil side of the igniter, send it to your RPM gauge, you're gonna have a functional tach.
The last thing I want to talk about is how I routed my wiring harness. Now, as I had mentioned before, on the S12, your ECU ends up on the driver's side over here. On the S13, it ends up, I guess technically on the driver's side on the other side because it is a JDM engine. Now, the way that I wired my wiring harness was all behind this fender. It's exactly how it is factory from the S12. There is one portion that wouldn't reach had I gone all the way around here and back, and that's the side that goes to the lower harness and that goes to the fuel injectors. For that, I popped a hole into the rain tray. Probably not ideal, but this connects out on this side and then runs into the driver's side footwell. That allows me to have a short run there, as well as a short enough run behind the fender here. Now, the two wires that I needed to extend in order to get everything to reach out here were my MAF wire. And now the MAF is disconnected. I just wanted to make some space to show you what was going on here. And the other one, I need to dig a little bit for it because I'm not actually using that functionality yet. Ah, it's right here. This wire right here is for the SR boost solenoid. In case I wanted to run with the 11 PSI on my wastegate, but right now I'm keeping it at 7. I'm happy with the car the way that it is. Now for the bad news. There is one thing about the gauge cluster that isn't going to be fully functional, and that is your oil pressure gauge. Now, our S12s on the original engines have oil pressure senders. What that means is it sends a variable voltage to your gauge so that you can see your oil pressure. The S13 and the SR uses an oil pressure switch. What that does is it simply grounds out your connection when you no longer have oil pressure, and in the S13, a light goes on saying, hey, oil pressure, stop the engine. When you combine that oil pressure switch with the S12's gauge cluster, what you get is an oil pressure gauge that goes to max oil pressure when the engine's not running, and then goes all the way to 0 oil pressure when the engine is running. So you can still use the gauge in that you know that if you're seeing oil pressure while the engine's running, you actually have no oil pressure, but obviously it isn't ideal. Now, what I believe to be the fix for this, though I haven't done it on my own car, is simply taking an S12 oil pressure sender and threading it right into the S13 block, because it is the same threading. That's it. That is everything that you need to know in order to fully wire an SR20DET into your S12. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end. If you get any value from this video, please drop a like, subscribe to the channel. If you have any questions, don't be shy to ask them in the comments, or you can find me on Reddit under the same name. Thanks again for watching.